She was 43 years old. The autumn the world decided she was worth nothing. Standing barefoot in the frost of a road she no longer had the right to walk. It was her late husband's cousin, Silas Ballard, who had cast her out. Silas, who held the paper on the farm and had smiled the whole time he signed it away to himself, calling it business, calling it mercy, calling it anything but the theft it was. She had $9.50 knotted into the corner of her apron and a tin cup and a good knife, and nothing else in the wide, dry breadth of Kansas that would answer to her name. And so, because a desperate woman will grasp at the one thing no one else will fight her for, she walked out to Miller's Rise above the town of Harker's Bluff and paid $9 whole, very nearly all she had for the collapsing windmill that old Tobias Vandermeer had let rot for 30 years and had, strangely, refused to sell to any man who ever asked. It was a fool's purchase, everyone agreed. A leaning ruin of gray timber that groaned in the wind and could not even turn. But sealed up in the dark of its rafters was the reason a proud old man had guarded a wreck until the day he died, a secret that would feed a starving town and hand justice, quiet and complete, to the man who had ruined her. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Maren Halloway. If you were watching tonight from some small place the maps have forgotten, some town the train stopped coming to, tell us its name in the comments, so that for a moment it is remembered. To understand what Maren did with a ruin, you must first understand the hands she did it with, and the woman who taught them. She had been born Maren Osgood in a sod house on the flat land west of the Smoky Hill River, the fourth of 6 children, and the only one, her mother used to say, who could not leave a broken thing alone. Where her brothers wanted to run the plow straight and be done, Maren wanted to know why the plow pulled crooked, and she would lie in the dust turning the coulter in her small hands until she found the bent place and worked it true. Her father was a quiet man who mended harness for half the county, and in the long winters he let her sit at his knee with the awl and the waxed thread, and he taught her the first law she ever truly believed, that almost nothing is ruined past saving, only past the patience of the people who own it. A thing thrown away, he told her, is very often a thing that simply outlasted its owner's willingness to understand it. She never forgot that. It became the shape of her. Her mother taught her the rest. Ada Osgood was a grave, clear-eyed woman who had come out from Pennsylvania with a chest of seeds sewn into the lining of her coat, and she kept those seeds the way other women kept scripture. She taught Maren to read the sky and the soil, to know by the smell of the wind whether rain was honest or only teasing, to save the strongest seed from the hardest year because, she said, the seed that survives a drought remembers it, and its children will be braver for the memory. In the terrible dry summer when Maren was 11, when other families watched their corn curl and burn, the Osgoods ate. Because Ada had hoarded a hard red wheat brought by the Mennonite families near Newton, a foreign grain the neighbors laughed at, squat and stubborn and slow, that the men said would never suit American ground. It suited drought. It suited Ada. And it taught Maren, at 11, watching her laughing neighbors go hungry beside their handsome dying corn, that the thing everyone mocks is very often the thing that will save them if only someone keeps it alive long enough to be believed. She married young, but not foolishly. Thomas Halloway was a broad gentleman with a farmer's back and a carpenter's eye, and together on a quarter section east of Harker's Bluff, they built something modest and real, a frame house, a good well, a wheat crop that came in a little better every year, because Maren planted her mother's stubborn red seed along the poorest edge of every field, where nothing else would grow, and let it prove itself. Neighbors came to her when a churn would not churn or a clock would not strike or a sewing machine seized, and she fixed them and would take no more than a jar of honey for it, because her father's law still lived in her hands. For 15 years, the Halloways were not rich, but they were rooted, and Maren believed, as rooted people do, that the ground beneath her was hers to stand on. She did not yet know how easily the ground can be signed out from under a woman while she sleeps. She did not yet know Silas. The fall, when it came the way falls always come. On the plains, first the sky, and then the men who use the sky. The rains failed in the spring of 1892, and failed again worse in 1893, and the whole of western Kansas cracked open under a sun that would not relent. Thomas took a fever that August, the kind that goes through a tired man like fire through August grass, And for all Maren's nursing, he was gone in 9 days. Buried on the rise behind the house, under a wooden cross, she planed and lettered herself, because there was no money for stone. She was a widow at 42 with a mortgaged farm, a burned crop, and a note at the Bluff bank that came due in the fall, and the man who held that note was Silas Ballard, Thomas's own cousin, who had lent them the money in the fat years with a handshake and a cousin's warm word, and who now, in the lean ones, revealed at last the ledger where his heart should have been. Silas Ballard had grown fat while the county starved. He had a way of appearing at a farmhouse the very week a man died, or a well went dry, hat in hand, voice full of sorrow, papers already drawn. He had bought up half the failing quarters around Harker's Bluff for pennies on their worth, and it was whispered, though no one could prove it, that he knew things before he ought to, that he had a friend at the railroad survey office in Topeka who had told him a spur line was coming through, and that every dusty foreclosed acre he gathered would be worth a fortune the day the rails were laid. He came to Maren in September with his sorrowful voice and his ready papers, and told her the note could not be carried, the times were hard, that he would take the farm and, out of family feeling, let her keep the clothes on her back. She asked him for one season, one more crop, one chance. He told her the land was already promised. She understood then that it had been promised before Thomas was cold, and that the fever had merely saved Silas the trouble of waiting. They put her off the land on a bright, pitiless morning in early October. The neighbors watched from their wagons and did not meet her eyes, because half of them owed Silas too, and a frightened man will look away from the thing he fears he will become. Maren walked out through the gate with $9.50 in her apron, her father's knife, her mother's last small twist of the stubborn red seed wrapped in oilcloth against her heart, and nothing more. She had nowhere to go. The boarding house wanted $1 a week she could not spare to spend, and it was there, at the very bottom of everything, standing in the road with the dust of her own farm still on her shoes, that she lifted her eyes to the ridge north of town and saw the old windmill of Tobias Vandermeer, black against the white sky, leaning like a tired giant, and remembered that it was the one thing in that country nobody wanted. Tobias Vandermeer had been dead 2 years by then, and in life he had been a mystery the town enjoyed more than it understood. He had come from the old country as a young man, a Dutch millwright, and had raised on Miller's Rise, a true tower windmill of the kind his father had built beside the North Sea, a great octagonal tower of oak and cottonwood, 4 broad sails, a grinding stone within, so that in the early years farmers had brought their wheat to Vandermeer's mill to be ground into flour, and the Rise had hummed with the turning of the sails and the low song of the stones. But somewhere in the middle of his life the sails had stopped. A storm cracked the great shaft, folks said. And though everyone knew Tobias could have mended it in a season, he could mend anything he never did. He let the sails hang broken. He let the tower gray and lean. He lived on there alone, tending a garden, grinding a little grain by hand for those who asked, turning away every land agent and speculator and hopeful buyer who ever climbed the Rise. Silas Ballard chief among them, with the same flat words. It is not for sale, and it never will be, and you would not understand why. When he died, the county took the ruin for back taxes and could find no one to buy it. For a windmill that will not turn is only a very tall barn full of pigeons, and the roof was going, and the whole thing was one hard winter from falling into the ravine. The clerk at the county office had all but forgotten it was on the books. So when Maren Halloway came down the county steps that October afternoon and laid her worn dollars on the counter and asked the price of the old Vandermeer mill and the little rise it stood on, the clerk laughed out loud, thinking it a joke. When he saw it was not, he named the smallest sum he decently could, $9, the exact figure of the unpaid tax, half expecting her to laugh too and go away. She counted out $9, folded her remaining 50 cents back into her apron, and took the deed in her chapped hands as though it were a thing of great and secret worth. Word ran through Harker's Bluff before she had even climbed the Rise. The widow Halloway, ruined and witless with grief, had spent nearly her last cent on a falling-down windmill that would not turn, and meant, they said, to live in it like an owl. They laughed at her over their suppers. Silas Ballard laughed loudest of all, for he had tried for years to buy that Rise and been refused, and it pleased him to think a foolish woman had thrown away her bread on a wreck he had wanted only for the acre it stood on. Maren did not hear the laughing, or did not let herself. She climbed to the mill in the last of the daylight and pushed open the great warped door, and the pigeons went up in a gray thunder, and she stood in the dim round of the tower and breathed the smell of old grain and older wood and 30 years of dust. And for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something that was almost not despair. It was her father's feeling, the tinkerer's feeling, the certainty that rises in some people at the sight of a broken thing, that there was a reason here, a why, waiting under the ruin for hands patient enough to find it. She had those hands. She had nothing else, but she had those. That first night she swept a corner clean and slept on empty grain sacks with the knife by her hand, and in the morning she began, as her father would have, at the bottom and worked up. She found the first clue on the third day, and she almost missed it. She had cleared the ground floor and mended the door and set snares for rabbits along the ravine to keep herself alive, and she had begun to climb the mill from stage to stage, testing each timber with the flat of her hand, learning the great machine the way she had once learned a stalled clock. It was on the second stage, where the light came thin through a shuttered window, that she noticed the grinding stones were not idle by accident. Someone had chalked them, deliberately, with hand-cut oak wedges, and greased the spindle against rust, and wrapped the great gears in oiled canvas, the careful work of a man laying something to sleep, not letting it die. A machine left to rot rusts fast. This one had been made ready to wake. Why? She wondered. Would a man stop his mill and then so tenderly preserve the very heart of it? And then, brushing the dust from the housing of the stones, her fingers found letters cut deep into the oak beam above them, worn but plain, in the square hand of a man who meant them to last. The seed is the true mill. Grind only what you can spare. She read it 3 times in the thin light, and did not understand it, and could not stop thinking of it. And that night, for the first time, she climbed toward the very top of the tower, toward the capped dark, under the great broken shaft, where the pigeons would not go. The stair gave out below the top stage, and she made the last of the climb on a ladder she pieced together from the ruin, up into the crown of the mill where the roof timbers met like the ribs of an overturned ship. It was black up there, and close, and thick with the smell of tar and something else, something dry and clean and grain-like, under the rot. She lit her last inch of candle and lifted it, and at first she saw only rafters, the great curved beams Vandermeer had shaped by hand, and then she saw that the rafters were wrong. They were too deep. Between the true roof beams and a false ceiling of close-fitted board, someone had built a hidden loft, a sealed chamber, the whole broad crown of the mill around, tarred against the weather and pegged shut, invisible from below and from without. A room that no buyer walking the ground floor could ever have guessed was there. Her heart went hard and quick in her chest. She found the seam of a small door set flush in the boards, and the wooden pin that held it, and she worked the pin free with her father's knife, and the little door swung down, and 30 years of a dead man's secret breathed out into her candlelight. The loft was full of grain, not loose grain crocks, row upon row of great stoneware crocks, each sealed with wax and a wooden lid and a cloth, ranked along the curved walls in the dry dark, dozens upon dozens of them, and every one, when she pried the first lid, brimming with hard red kernels of wheat, squat and stubborn and cool to the touch, so much like her mother's foreign seed that her breath caught, but it was not only wheat. Beside the crocks stood a strong box of oak bound in iron, and on the strong box lay a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, and a single letter, folded and sealed, that had waited 2 years in the dark with her name, not on it, but a name that would do as well, to however loves this mill enough to climb. She sat down among the crocks, with the candle guttering and the pigeons murmuring far below, and she broke the seal, and she read by that last small flame the words of Tobias Vandermeer, and learned at last why a proud old man had let the world believe he was a fool. He had written it plain, in the same square hand as the beam. He wrote that he had watched, over 30 years, the drought come to that country again and again, and each time he had watched good families starve or sell or flee, and each time he had watched the money men of the Bluff grow fat on their ruin, buying land and seed both when folk were desperate enough to sell their own future to eat today. He wrote that a mill is only a machine for making bread out of grain, but that the true mill, the older mill, the one that never breaks, is the seed itself, for a full granary feeds a town one winter, but a saved seed feeds it every winter after. World without end. And so, he wrote, he had stopped his sales on purpose. He had let the town believe the mill was broken, and himself a stubborn old fool, because a working mill draws men who want to own it, but a ruin draws no one, and a ruin was the safest vault in the county. Behind that pretense, he had spent 30 years doing the only thing he thought could outlast the greed of men, hoarding in secret the hardiest drought-proof seed wheat he could gather and grow and select, crock by crock, year by year, the very red wheat the Mennonites had brought, bred stubborner still by his own patient hand against the day the country's whole store of it should fail, so that when everything else was gone, there would still be, up here in the dark above the town that laughed at him, enough true seed to sow every farm on the plain and begin again. And in the strong box, the letter said, she would find the rest of it. Maren opened the strong box with a small iron key Vandermeer had named in his letter, hung on a nail behind the little door, and found the papers that turned her secret from a wonder into a weapon. There were deeds, a thick sheaf of them, the mortgages of a dozen Harker's Bluff farms, the very notes Silas Ballard believed he alone held. For Tobias Vandermeer had not been the poor eccentric the town supposed. Quietly, through a lawyer in Salina, and never in his own name, he had for years bought up the failing notes of his neighbors from the banks that wished to be rid of them, paying them off and holding them himself, meaning the letter said to forgive them, to hand each family back its own land, free and clear the day the drought broke and the seed went out. He had died before the drought broke. He had died before he could tell a living soul. And so the deeds had lain in the dark for 2 years, while Silas Ballard foreclosed and gloated and gathered foreclosed. Maren saw with a cold, clear rush, on land whose notes he did not truly hold at all, land the county had let him seize, because no one knew that a dead millwright's iron box already held the paper that made his claims worth nothing. Her own farm's note was there among them, Thomas's name, her name, paid in full. 2 years. Before Silas ever put her out the gate. She could have used it for herself alone. That is the thing we ask you to hold in your mind, watching her sit up there in the ruined crown of that mill with a fortune in seed at her back and the deed to her own stolen home in her 2 hands. She could have taken the paper that proved her farm was hers, and walked down the rise, and gone home, and let the rest of the town fend as it might, and no one would have blamed her, and many would have called it only fair. But Maren Halloway had been raised by a woman who saved seed through a drought so her neighbors' children might eat, and by a man who believed nothing is ruined past saving, only past the patience of its keeper, and she had lain in the dust at 11 years old and learned that the thing the world mocks is the thing that saves it. She sat in the dark a long while, and then she wrapped the deeds again in their oilcloth, and sealed the crocks she had opened, and climbed down out of the mill, and began quietly, patiently, the only way she knew to do exactly what Tobias Vandermeer had spent 30 years and his whole strange, dignified life preparing for someone, at last, to do. It could not be done in secret for long, and it was Silas who forced it into the open. When word crept down from the rise that the widow Halloway had not gone mad in her windmill but was mending it, and that farmers were seen climbing to her door and coming down with their faces changed, Silas Ballard grew uneasy. For uneasy is the natural condition of a man whose fortune rests on things staying hidden. He rode up to Miller's Rise himself on a hard, bright morning with 2 men from the bank behind him, and he found Maren at the foot of her tower with her sleeves rolled and greased to her elbows, and he told her, in his sorrowful, reasonable voice, that there was some question about the county's sale of the mill, some irregularity, and that it might be best for a woman alone to let him take the worthless Rise off her hands and give her a few dollars for her trouble. He had come, in short, to buy the vault at last, having failed to buy it from the man who built it, and he did not know, looking at the leaning ruin, that he was standing under the very rafters that held his ruin above his head. Maren looked at him a long moment, the cousin who had put her out with the dust of her own farm on her shoes, and she did not rage, because her mother had taught her that rage is a fire that grinds no grain. She told him plainly that the mill was not for sale, and that it never would be, and she could not help it, and would not have unsaid it that he would not understand why. The old man's words, thrown back into the world, Silas laughed. But the laugh had gone thin at the edges, and he warned her, less sorrowful now, that she was a foolish woman, standing on a foolish claim, and that he had the law and the bank and the whole town behind him, and that he could make her leave the rise as easily as he had made her leave her home. And that, though he never knew it, was the moment he lost, for it hardened in Maren the last of her hesitation. That night she did not sleep. She sat by her candle with the strongbox open, and she copied the deeds out in her own careful hand, farm by farm, name by name, and in the gray of the morning she walked down into Harker's Bluff, carrying the oilcloth bundle against her heart the way she had once carried her mother's seed. And she went not to the bank but to the office of the county judge, a tired, honest old man named Amos Cade, who had known Tobias Vandermeer and had always half believed there was more to the millwright than the town allowed. What happened then happened not in a day but across a hard, bright autumn, and it happened the way true things happen, slowly, against resistance, and then all at once. Judge Cade examined the deeds and sent to Selina for the lawyer whose name was on them, and the lawyer came, an old man himself now, and confirmed every one. The notes were genuine, the payments recorded, the mortgages of a dozen families discharged in full 2 years and more before Silas Ballard had foreclosed on a single one of them. The foreclosures were void. The land had never legally been his to take. And when the judge's men opened the county's own dusty records against the deeds, they found the second thing, the thing that finished Silas for Vandermeer's lawyer had, at the old man's instruction, kept copies of the correspondence, and among it were letters that showed Silas had known years back that some of those notes had been bought out from under him and had foreclosed anyway, gambling that a dead man's secret would stay dead. It had not. It had waited in the rafters for a woman patient enough to climb. They gave the farms back. That is the heart of it, and we will not rush past it. One by one, through that autumn and into the winter, the families of Harker's Bluff were called to Judge Cade's office and handed back the deeds to their own land, free and clear, exactly as Tobias Vandermeer had meant them to be handed, and beside each deed, from the widow Halloway, who might have kept it all, a gift, a crock of the old man's stubborn red seed, enough to sow the poorest field, with her mother's instruction passed on plain, to plant it along the driest edge where nothing else would grow and let it prove itself, and to save the strongest seed from the hardest year, because the seed that survives a drought remembers it. The rains came thin that next spring, and thinner the year after, but the red wheat did not care. It had been bred in the dark by a patient hand for exactly such years, and it came up stubborn and squat and green across a country that had all but given up on green, and Harker's Bluff, which had been dying, did not die. The mill turned again, too. Maren mended the great cracked shaft over that first winter, the way everyone had always known Vandermeer could have and never understood why he didn't, and the sails came round slow, and then sure in the prairie wind, and the low song of the stones came back to the rise, and folk brought their wheat to be ground and paid the widow in honey and eggs, and more than that, in the thing she had lost and found again, a place that called her by her name. As for Silas Ballard, there was no need to lift a hand against him, for the same law he had trusted to break the weak broke him when the truth came out. The voided foreclosures ruined him. The families he had wronged sued back the pennies he had paid, and won. The railroad, hearing the land was clouded and the man disgraced, ran its spur through a different county, so that the fortune he had schemed and stolen for evaporated like rain that only teased the dust. He left Harker's Bluff before the second harvest, on a hired wagon, with far less than he had come with, and no one climbed the rise to laugh, because the town had learned something too grave for laughter, that the man they had all feared had been hollow, and the woman they had all mocked had been full, and that they had not been able to tell the difference until the Rafters told them. That was his justice. Not violence, not vengeance, only the quiet arithmetic of a world set right, in which a man who built on other people's ruin discovered that ruin is a poor foundation, and a woman who built on other people's saving discovered she was standing, at last, on solid ground. She was 43 years old. The autumn, the world decided she was worth nothing, and by the autumn after, that same world knew it had been wrong, though the world is slow to say so, and she never asked it to. Remember how they laughed when Maren Halloway spent nearly her last $9 on a collapsing windmill that would not turn? A fool's purchase? A widow's madness? a leaning ruin full of pigeons that no man in the county would take for free. Remember that the thing everyone throws away is very often the thing that was quietly holding everything up. What she found in those rafters was not gold and was better than gold. It was seed and the deeds to a dozen stolen homes and the plain last will of a proud old man who had let himself be called a fool for 30 years so that the future would have somewhere to hide until a patient soul came to set it free. Maren was that soul because she had been taught to be by a father who knew nothing is ruined past saving, and a mother who saved the stubborn seed the neighbors mocked. She did not use what she found to make herself rich. She used it to give a town back its land and its bread and its name, and in doing so she got back her own. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. That overlooked value is still value, that quiet resilience outlasts loud greed, and that the true mill, the one that never breaks, is not the tower on the hill but the patient, saving, unbroken heart that keeps something good alive in the dark until the world is ready to be fed. Thank you for climbing all the way up here with us tonight, and for sitting a while in the quiet crown of Maren Halloway's mill. If this story warmed something in you, share it with someone who feels, right now, like a thing the world has written off because they are almost never as worthless as they have been told, and neither, we promise you, are you. Before you go, let us leave you with one question to carry into your week. And if you feel like it, answer us below where we can read it. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had given up on? We would love to know. Take care of the overlooked things, and the overlooked people, and the stubborn seed in your own two hands. Until next time, stay close.